Well, I was unable to go for a while during the COVID shutdown, but I was there in January and February this year. And I usually try and go every year. So I'm very disappointed at some of the things that have happened in the last 8 years. Um, and I'm worried about the economic situation for, let's say, the largest number of people in Egypt, uh, given the rising prices and all the insecurity that's sort of been triggered not only by the war in Ukraine, but um, over several years. So I think economically, it's rocky. Politically, it just, it hasn't opened as it could have, considering there's really no competition with the government and its leaders. So I'm disappointed about that. All the building, all the grand projects and the construction, I feel two ways. I mean, some of them were really needed. Um, some things look much better. Other things, it seems that they move very quickly. And as they're buildings and sites of historical importance that are being destroyed. On the other hand, all this infrastructure really did need um, renovation. So, and then Egypt's image in the world, I think, is problematic now. And that's hard to explain to people inside Egypt who, of course, see the world from their own local perspective, and the kind of news that we get about Egypt in the outside world, which is different than someone like myself who I want to read about Egypt every day, several times a day, which is different than someone who maybe sees one story or two in the media. So I'm concerned. Uh, I I like certain things I saw. I took a group. I've never done this. I haven't been involved in tourism in Egypt, but I convinced a group that I liked very much that they needed to go to Egypt. So I was with 70 people who haven't been in Egypt before. And my assignment was to explain why is Egypt the way it is now. That's what they asked me, which is difficult to get at in even 2 hours of speaking. I think that there is a sincere desire to do better in areas in which he has been criticized. So if you're cynical, you could say this is just to present better optics, that there's an effort that will be made to reach across society. And there have been actually a lot of pardons that were issued, and hopefully there will be more to certain political prisoners, yet at the same time, others are still being arrested. So I think the president and his closest advisors are aware of how this looks, and they want to make an effort to do something about it. And I don't know how it can accomplish its goals if it does not involve really reaching, you know, across the gap, across the chasm to those who truly oppose the government, which it's not doing. That's not, those aren't the rules. That's what I was just hinting at. I think if you're going to have any type of national reconciliation, be it only a conversation or a dialogue in the form of a conference, you really need to involve everyone. And that's been my opinion for a long time. But I am aware that many others don't agree with me and press very hard to have the Brotherhood criminalized, you know, early on. And because it was criminalized again, um, it that's an excuse for not including. But I think it's you know, it's very problematic not only bridging that chasm uh, and therefore not talking to those Egyptians who maybe had to flee the country and really oppose the government, but also with certain sectors of liberals who were either allies or not exactly allies, but co-participants in the 2011 revolution, and who feel very bitter at what happened since. So I think the idea of reconciliation and conversation is very, very important, but it can't be successful. It's like having, you know, if we had tried to have reconciliation between Democrats and Republicans in the United States, or between those who are truly Trump supporters and don't acknowledge the current government, um, without talking to each other, you know, it won't get anywhere. You know, they were both my students, my graduate students. Subhi the year before Sisi. So I actually know both of them. And I know that this was presented as a, like a retirement rather than an overthrowing. And the two are very different. But I think it's less so a personal action of the president and more so a decision of the military leadership, which is pretty shadowy to most in the outside world. But I believe these are group decisions that are made, not decisions by an individual. And those decisions have to do with ensuring stability and continuing power and influence of the military. That report, you know, I read it, one version, and then I read the Middle East Monitor's summary. So this is a very difficult area that's often described as military civilian relations. So it's one aspect of it, is how political do you allow the military to be? In some countries, military is not allowed to vote, yet it's very important in politics. In other countries, the military is allowed to vote, but they're supposed to keep their political views and affiliation less visible. Like they can't wear a, you know, button here on their uniform. And the most, I guess, the most important aspect is the immunity granted to officers and their families, and how far that immunity will go, um, and how that will be viewed by other segments of society in Egypt. I don't think it's surprising that these measures are going through. It's another layer of self-protection for the military. Okay, so he actually uh, he was in my seminar, so it's kind of hard to describe this program at the Army War College, but it's very different than my university. UCLA is a gigantic, huge university where I hardly knew my fellow students. At the Army War College, there are 300, at that time, there were 350 students and about 50 foreign officers. Now there are more. They're divided into small seminars of 13 people. Within each seminar, there are 2 foreign officers. They try to have 1 woman. They try to have a fair representation of non-Army, that is Navy or medics, logistics, other services who happen to be their Department of State. So I actually got to know him very well because he was in my seminar, and the seminar leader, a friend of mine, had a stroke, so I had to take over. And then he was in a large, huge class on regional studies of the Middle East. So this is much more than counterterrorism. It involves ideas of building democracy. What is the role of the US in US defense policy in various regions of the world, in this case in the Middle East, and why is that role the way it is? And at that time, of course, the US was embroiled in Iraq and in the War on Terror. And the War on Terror was cast as, a long war, decades-long war that involves all kinds of different extremist Islamist groups. But the war in the Sinai has involved a group like that. And Sisi was also in a special seminar on counterterrorism where I was a guest. So I got to, see his reaction to what was taught. However, that course was heavily theoretical in some ways. And the war in the Sinai is not theoretical. And it's been a fierce and difficult and long battle that involves both offering carrot and stick. So punitive campaign against the militants, but also trying to be aware of what the population in the Sinai has gone through, and the government's been criticized a lot for measures that it took that involved dislocating people and relocating them, and then their economic situation and whether they're truly being treated as Egyptian citizens. So I think this lasted a long time, and it's very much like other examples that the militaries have studied in counterterrorism, which tend to be fierce and difficult when they are waged in outlying territories, where it's easy to hide, it's easy to smuggle, it's easy for money to move in and move out, as well as people. So I think this campaign lasted longer and was worse than it might have been, and now it's in a better situation than it was earlier. How much he learned from what we offered, I don't know, because counterterrorism is it's it's not the military's favorite means of combat, because it involves thinking very long term and evolving a long term strategy, and dealing with what we would call guerrilla elements, which engage in actions of terror to magnify their impact. So it's a very difficult kind of warfare, and the military in the U.S. draws a distinction between counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. He learned all these distinctions, but in the end, I'm not sure that it helps in how we theorize about this kind of struggle. I disagree with some of the decisions that were made, because I'm not privy to how this is happening. I deduce that some decisions are made by advisors and others, and some may be led by the president. In general, I said in interviews earlier that I thought his personality was helpful to him, in that he tended to take what was happening and reflect on it, and then react in time rather than getting angry. And again, this college, it's not similar to a college of young people in their 20s. These are older individuals with long experience, often leading battalions, in warfare. So they have experience, and they often have very set opinions, which it's our job to challenge and look at. So I don't know how close he is to the way he was at that time, but I thought at that time that the quiet aspect of his personality and seeming humility were good. But of course, they're counterbalanced by all the pomp and circumstance that goes along with being president, and trying to give a grand image of things. So he's being criticized for all the building, the big projects, the new administrative capital, the new museum, which I really liked, and other things that I actually liked. So, but I don't know. I actually asked him I made a formal request for an interview, because I thought it might be a good project to begin a biography of him, and I didn't want to do that without, information from a living person. So I've written biographies of dead people who I couldn't interview. And my request was rejected, but it might have been the timing. So who knows if that will happen? And then I'll be able to answer your question, perhaps. Well, first of all, I think you're alluding to his strategic research paper, which is, it's like a short thesis that is required in this program. But it's supposed to focus on strategy, which is a little bit different than other things one could write a thesis about. So the idea was, what would be your strategy for encouraging democracy in the Middle East? And he did use the example of Egypt, but he began it more broadly. And some of the issues that he pointed out were the sorry state of the educational system, and that he would want to reform the educational system. And the educational system in Egypt still has a long way to go, and there are many, many problems that have arisen from the attempt to reform it. Just as like uh, changing the to an electronic system during the exams and all this kind of thing. So that's not solved yet. I don't think he changed his mind, and I don't think the paper was as simple as democracy is the best system for Egypt. I think he was responding to other individuals in the War College. A lot of people, a lot of American officers kept saying, you can't have democracy in the Middle East. And this is sort of a racist argument they were making, that Muslims aren't democratic. The historical examples in the region aren't democratic. They're either autocracies or monarchies, or systems where many forces combine to impede democracy. So I think his paper was intended to say democracy is possible, and it can even have Islamic sources, and those being the process of shura, of consultation, and so on. So that's very, very far back then, writing paper, to what is happening now. And I do think that his government has backed away from democracy in the sense of allowing open opposition. And I understand the reasons this was done, that initially the protests after the coup, or the coup-volution, or the People's Revolution, whatever you want to call it, after June 30th, the protests against it were violent, and they wanted to impede and stop this violence, and efforts to sabotage, and so on. But if you shut down opposition to a certain degree, it simply will move elsewhere. It will move underground. It will move out of the country, which is kind of what happens. So there's this pretty relentless, critical media eye on Egypt from outside Egypt. And then the closure of so many, more in the past, more independent than they are now, media voices in Egypt. And I don't think that's good for society. I think the longer a society lives in an anti-democratic state, the more difficult it is for it to build a democratic state where you can tolerate other opinions that are completely counter to your own. So I think the sacrifice was made in the name of stability and survival, economic and political survival at the time. And one hopes it could still move forward. I mean, a democratic Egypt one day.